Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. The Woman in the Hat by Parmesan Sprinkles. This is a story that happened to me when I was in junior high. I just turned 41, so this was when I was between 14 and 16 years of age. Many moons ago, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. Anyway, I remember my friend George was one of the few who were considered to be one of my best friends. There was a small group of us at the time, and we always hung out in school and after school and on the weekends, etc. Well, I remember this was when my friend George's mother had just bought a house from her boyfriend's neighbor because her boyfriend knew she was tired of living in an apartment and was looking for a house. He saw this as a perfect opportunity since it was next door to his family's house he had grown up in and actually still lived in with his family and cousins at the time. She had just finished the process of buying the house from the previous owners and was ready to move in. She got settled in, and now her and George were about to spend their first week there. That whole week at school, George was excited, telling me how cool his new house was and how much better it was than all his old apartments. I was happy to see him so happy. It made me feel excited for him, and the best part is my mother lived with my grandmother and her mom at the time, and about 5 minutes from George's new house, so it made hanging out much simpler than before, especially being kids in junior high in the 90s. The first weekend of George living at the new house was coming up after hearing him brag all week. George asked if I wanted to come hang out during the weekend since they were barbecuing with his mom's boyfriend and his family. Of course, I didn't pass up the opportunity. So immediately after school that Friday, we all headed over to George's. It was a fun day to say the least. It was like two houses in one because everyone was going freely back and forth from George's house to George's mom's boyfriend's house, both having food and music. It was great. Nighttime finally approached, and it was getting late. I told George and his mom that I was heading home, and George's mom said, "Maybe you should stay the night and go home in the morning when the sun comes up." And George was like, "Yeah, man, the whole family's going to put on a new horror movie and watch it." If I'm not mistaken, I think it was the movie I Know What You Did Last Summer. It had just been released on VHS at the time. About 30 minutes into the movie, I asked if I could go to the restroom, and George's mom said, "My electricity won't be turned on until Monday. I'm actually borrowing electricity from my boyfriend next door until then," which meant she was running electrical cords from his house, which in those days people did when they needed, and they migrated them to their living room, meaning the rest of the house was dark. In those days, we didn't have cell phones like today. What with the little flashlights. We had house phones, and if you had a cell phone, it was huge, and it didn't have a flashlight. They also cost a lot more than they do today. When I got done using the bathroom, I headed back towards the living room, guiding myself by touching the walls. I decided to take a detour to the kitchen to get something to drink out of the ice chest, and I saw a silhouette of a woman in what looked like a 1950s-style dress, but a fancy one. And she had a big hat with roses on it. The top part of her dress hugged her figure, but the bottom part was wide like a bell. It was an older style dress, and I assumed it was George's mom's boyfriend's grandma. I said, "Excuse me, I didn't see you there," because it was dark without the light, and then I went about my way to the living room where I could see much easier due to the TV being a big screen. I told George's mom, "Sorry, I almost didn't see your boyfriend's grandma in the kitchen, but don't worry, she's safe." That's when they all looked at me like I was crazy. I mean, everyone's jaw dropped. That's when George's mom's boyfriend was like, "Grandma? My grandmother lives far away. What do you mean an old lady is in the kitchen?" So he got up and walked in there trying to get light from his lighter, but no one was there. Then he searched the whole house. There was no one. That's when he asked me, how did this lady look? And I described her as a lady who had great taste in clothing because it was a fancy 1950s-style dress and a huge hat that had roses on it. He then started walking back and forth dramatically like he was trying to get his point across through emotion, that he was really scared about something. That's when he said, "Hold on, I'll be right back. And as a matter of fact, everyone follow me. Let's go next door to my house." So we all followed him where all the lights were working perfectly fine. And he went and pulled out a picture from an old canister that held some of his family photos. He pulled 2 from the stack and showed me the first one. It was a picture of his grandma. And what do you know about a lady who resembled the woman I saw in the kitchen? Even had her style of clothing and everything. It wasn't the same thing I saw her wearing, but a similar style. Then he pulled out a picture someone took of his grandmother at the same lady's funeral, standing next to the casket crying because they were best friends. And in that pic, the lady from the kitchen was wearing the same dress in her casket that she was wearing when I saw her in the kitchen. That's when George's mom's boyfriend said, "You saw my grandma's best friend." She originally owned that house and was related to the people George's mom bought the place from. That whole night, they all migrated everything to George's mom's boyfriend's house so that they considered it important until that following Monday when George's power would be turned on. No one wanted to be in there while there was no electricity. And George's mom did not want to run into her in the dark. George didn't seem to mind, though. He actually thought it was cool. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the story, I just turned 41, and I remembered everything about that day and what led up to that day like it happened just yesterday. Anyway, I thought I would share. You can help pass on the story whenever you find yourself at a campfire and want to scare your family and friends. Maybe even have a barbecue while doing it. The people in the story, I didn't use their real names. That's intentional, to keep them private. Crying Woman at the Park by Dizzy Purpose. Fair warning before I get into this, I'm not the greatest writer, but I will try my best for this one. This happened a few days ago from when I'm writing today. Where I live, we have a lot of parks, but as 2 teenage girls going to hang with guys, me and my friends obviously picked the biggest one, where there was more to do and less people around. For some context, I'll just say this park is down the street from a few halfway houses and work releases for the recently released criminals. And a lot of the time, the ones who get the days out and don't have anywhere to go end up at the park, just to have some time away. So more likely than not, when me and my friends went to hang out or do teenage things, there would already be a few tweakers and sketchy people there that we'd have to watch out for. This day in particular, the guys we were with were boring us more than usual, so we were just sitting on the sidewalk talking and halfway listening to them, when a girl walked up to us. Well, I'm not naive or stupid, especially in that park, and especially where I live. I am a girl, and I won't turn away from a young girl who was crying, upset, or missing her shoes and phone. I'm going to avoid saying the girl's name and a lot of the names in this story. But the girl asked me if she could use my phone to make a call. And I, of course, had the thought that this girl might just run away with my phone. But again, I'd rather help if she actually needed it than not. So I offered her my phone, and she held it for a few minutes before beginning to cry again, because she couldn't seem to remember anyone's number. I told her it was okay, and she began to break down and told us how she didn't seem to remember what had happened to her last night. She told us she had been with a man and went out for drinks to just have fun, when all of a sudden he got very angry, and she couldn't remember anything that happened after that. Just being found in a parking lot and being taken to the local hospital, where she was treated for a head injury and very obvious bruises all over her body. She said they refused to give her a rape kit, and then they dropped her off at this park because she didn't remember how to get home. She kept apologizing and saying she didn't mean to ruin our day. But at that point, me and my friend no longer cared about the guys we were with, just about getting this girl some help. I offered to call 911, and she shared concern of how the police wouldn't care because she's a woman of color, and I could understand that being one myself. We got her blankets and food and whatever she needed and promised we would take her to the hospital instead of calling an ambulance, mostly because I knew she didn't want to deal with police again or get into another ambulance right away. We told her that we would lobby for her and stay with her the entire time, but she didn't love the idea, and I could tell she was getting agitated and aggressive towards us. That was our first red flag. When my friend left to go get her car from across the park, she shared with me she was scared that they would put her back into the psych ward. I didn't know the story and couldn't promise they wouldn't. I could only promise that we would go with her and stay as long as we were allowed. But she kept crying and asking her to take her to a local store. So we, not wanting to upset her more and make it worse, decided to take her there. The store was only a few miles away from the park we were at, so it was no big deal. But the whole ride, the girl kept digging in her bag, and that's when I first realized I felt a little uneasy about the situation. She didn't seem to take her hand out of the bag the whole 7-minute ride, and until we got there, she seemed to be staring at me and talking to herself. I didn't think much of it because she had gone through a traumatic experience, and I wasn't going to minimize that. When we arrived at the store, she instructed us to take her to the back of the store where 2 men were waiting. She got out of the car and ran towards the men, crying and breaking down. But the man stood there, not making any moves to comfort her or show any empathy that I thought would be normal in that situation. We got out of the car to go and explain the situation, and I have never seen someone care so little about someone they apparently knew. The man was gripping her wrists and not even looking at her. This was another red flag. At that point, I knew that something wasn't right, and this man was not going to give the girl any help. When my friend finished explaining the situation, the man started to say that they were going to take care of it, and if we wanted, we could come with them. While we had told her that we were going to stay with her, I didn't see the point anymore, and I didn't want to go with this man. And I thought it was obvious to my friend, too. My friend said we could follow in our car if they needed someone to explain to the hospital, but the man insisted we all take his car, which was a smaller car, not big enough to fit all of us. He gave the girl a look, and she started walking back towards us, mentioning how we said we would stay with her, and she wasn't actually crying anymore, just making a face like she was. And when we kept saying we could go with our car, the girl reached for my friend and started getting aggressive and yelling at her. She was holding my friend's arm at that point and not letting her go. I started trying to get her to let go of my friend's arm, who was obviously freaking out a little. And this girl was just yelling and screaming in her face. The man started saying something about how was he supposed to believe that we weren't a part of it, and we probably hurt the girl and we were just bringing her back now, and that we needed to go with him. He grabbed my arm and started trying to pull me towards the car without making a scene, and even though I was scared, I'm not a person to freeze under pressure. So I started pulling back, trying to get away from the man. But I'm not a very strong teenager, and the man was definitely going to get me into the car. But before he could, my friend pushed the girl's arm off of her and started to scream. The kind of scream that only comes from a teenage girl, and the kind that gets people to look. The man dropped my arm and pushed me away and dragged the girl from the park into his car before driving off and leaving us standing there in the parking lot. At that point, we were freaking out and got into my friend's car. We didn't know what to do at that point, and stupidly, I'm still worried about the girl in the park, because I don't think my mind really wrapped around the fact that she was trying to get us into the car with that man. We called 911 and explained the whole situation from the start, even the beginning story of the girl, and they said they would get back to us with some information. We got a few calls from the police over the next few days, and the summary of the story that we got from them was that the woman we had tried to help had been at the hospital the night before, but not for what she said. She was there because she was found having mental health problems, which was common for her, as well as being brought in for drug abuse. The man in the parking lot, however, was not her boyfriend, or a family member. They still don't know who he was to her, just that he had been charged with aggravated kidnapping on multiple occasions. So, to the crying girl in the park and the man in the parking lot, let's not meet again. Stuck in a Loop by Ambitious Pin. This happened to me back in January of this year, 2025. I'm a male and 15 years old. I live in California. During that time, it rains a lot in NorCal, but the rain had stopped after school, so I decided to hang out with some friends at a shopping plaza. After hanging out for a while, around 6, I decided I needed to head home since it was becoming late, and I needed to get home by 8. Since I didn't have a ride, I was going to walk all the way home. It was about a 40 to 50-minute walk, but I thought it was good exercise. For a better visualization, imagine a shopping area on a map, and my home was headed north from there. And in between the path, there was a trail that led straight to where my house was. But before I could reach the beginning, I had to either cut through the street or a quiet neighborhood. So I decided the neighborhood. There was less cars and it was more peaceful. So all I had to do was walk straight through it to get out of there and into the trail. But as soon as I entered it, it started pouring heavily. I started picking up the pace and was walking for what felt like 10 minutes. I felt like I was going straight. But then I started to feel dizzy and out of place. I didn't see anyone. I felt lost. And then I fell right in the middle of a puddle, and it felt like absolute hell. And at that point, I realized I was lost. So I pulled out my phone under a tree, but my Google Maps wasn't working, and my compass thing was glitching, and the map couldn't say my location. I started freaking out. I'd been through this neighborhood countless times, maybe not just walking, but I didn't remember it being that large. I started to disassociate, and I started aimlessly walking. I was on the verge of tears, and then I finally saw the end, or so I thought. I ended up right where I had started, the shopping plaza. I just about fell over crying. I just wanted to go home, and I started to think maybe I was dreaming. I probably looked insane, and I looked at my phone, and it was working now. I saw many missing calls from my mom. An hour had passed, and it was almost 8 p.m. I ended up getting an Uber home, but I will always look back wondering if it was just the rain, but even still, it was still heavily raining. I don't know. Maybe that area is cursed or haunted or something. I guess I'll never know. Trust Your Gut by Pristine Tension. About a week ago, I came across a video on TikTok that said, "Always trust your gut," and "Every time you leave the house, lock the door and look around you." I didn't think much of it at the time, but for some reason, it stuck with me. A few days later, I was leaving my house to meet up with some friends. I was home alone. I locked the front door like always, and suddenly that video came back to my mind. Something told me, just take a look around. I looked around the front, nothing, everything seemed normal. But I had this weird gut feeling, so I decided to check the back of the house too. That's when I saw it. A car parked about 30 or 50 meters away, facing directly towards my house. Two men were sitting inside, and they weren't talking, and they weren't on their phones. They were just watching. My heart dropped. I reached for my phone to take a picture, and as soon as I did, they started up the car and sped off. It wasn't random. They weren't lost or waiting for someone. They were watching my house, watching me, and they didn't want to be caught. What makes this creepier is that 6 days before this happened, I had been in a car accident. It wasn't major, but bad enough. And the strange part? For days before that crash, I had this nagging feeling something was going to happen. Like a little voice telling me, slow down, drive safe. I ignored that voice and ended up flipping my car. But I didn't ignore the feeling this time. And maybe that saved me from something worse. Now, every time I walk home alone or lock up the house, I get that same feeling, like something is off, like someone's still watching and waiting for me to drop my guard again. To the two men in that car, whoever you are, let's not meet. Bruce, A Man from My Childhood by Walleye Fishing. I grew up in a small town in central Washington, one of those little farming towns you pass on your way to somewhere more interesting. I was born in December of 1970. Most of my childhood was spent working alongside my father on the farm or helping out with the family business. I was put to work the second I could stay on my feet. And that said, those rare moments of freedom felt all the sweeter because of it. My family raised cattle and did construction work for generations. My father spent long hours breaking his back to provide for us, and for that I'll always be grateful. Humble living, it's the key to a fruitful life, my grandpa always told my dad. My mother was a soft-spoken, almost mystical type. She came from Ireland when she was just 2. And it's weird. I swear she had magic or witchcraft, but just for the most mundane things. You had zits? No problem. She'd prick your finger with a needle and circle where your zits were with your finger. Same thing with warts. There was one ritual where she used a nail and a string and be able to tell you how many kids you were going to have and their genders. That one I always thought was fake. There was no logical way to tell it accurately. And sure enough, everyone she tried it on either came to be correct or was correct, even with my 3 sons that I had 20 years later. I could write a whole story about my mother, but I'll leave that story to rest for now. As I said before, I lived in a smaller town, and anyone who has lived in a small town knows the pros and cons of small town life. The pros, you're closer with everyone, and everyone knows who you are. The cons, you're closer with everyone, and everyone knows who you are. It truly was a double-edged sword. And that being said, our community was very connected, just a few farmers and their families. We'd meet in the Grange Hall for something we called family lunch every Sunday after church. It was a good time to chat with those you didn't get to see, or for some, have a meal with other people rather than an empty house. Families would cook food the night prior, and it would be a mini potluck every Sunday afternoon. It really bonded our small, quaint town. That said, if there was a problem or if someone had a problem, we all knew it before sundown. No story could escape this town's grasp. Information would usually get passed around during the wives' book talk meetings. Because of this, we could never get away from anything. Even back then, before a world of cell phones, it was almost as if we had cameras on us. With everyone always seeing each other and talking, I remember distinctly when the whispers around the town started. I was 15, and this mysterious man was the talk of the town. This man supposedly wore a white shirt, red hat, blue jeans, and dark brown work boots. Bruce Springsteen had released Born in the USA around that time as well. Thus, everyone around here started to call this man Bruce. At first, all of us neighborhood kids thought it was another boogeyman tale. The parents would tell us, keep your window closed or Bruce will get you. Or, don't go alone in the woods, that man will come and get you. None of us really took the story seriously, as kids do. During that time, the only thing we cared about was camping outside in the forest and pretending to be G.I. Joe members in the midst of a heated conflict. Some kids would say they saw Bruce in the tree line when we were out there, but no one would take that seriously, and they'd get called a bitch or something. Even with this, even so, we'd still kind of get that chill down our spine at night. The same chill you get when someone was spying on you. In hindsight, even though we'd tease those kids for saying they saw Bruce, we all still had the fear of him spotting us. Bruce was also said to watch kids through their windows while they slept, and I remember thinking I was invulnerable to being seen by Bruce because my window was on the second story of our house. But I still kept my blinds closed just in case. When summer ended and the dreaded school year came back around, the noise about Bruce around the town diminished. I even forgot about him for a time. It seemed as if the hype around the town's resident boogeyman had left as fast as he had come. Though diminished, there were still the occasional whispers about him around family lunch. One Sunday afternoon in the middle of fall, I remember my father was speaking to one of our neighbors. Davy's son says he saw that man looking through his window the other night. That's a load of horseshit and you know it. That whole Bruce thing was a boogeyman story to get the kids to behave, my father said. My neighbor retorted, maybe, but even Davy seemed shaken up from it. My neighbor was right, too. I was close with Johnny, and he and his entire family swore up and down about it. Johnny told me that he woke up early one morning with that same chill-down-your-spine feeling. He told me, dude, it was freaky. He was just standing there, and his hat kind of covered his face, so it was hard to see what he looked like. He said that later he screamed for his dad, and the dude still just stood there. No reaction or anything, he just kept looking directly at Johnny. When his dad finally stumbled into the room and noticed Bruce, he bolted outside with his shotgun in his hand. Johnny said that the man had no reaction to his father either. He just kept standing there, staring intently. By the time the front door opened and the first shot rang out, Bruce was gone, like a ghost disappearing into fog. Mr. Felterman swore that 1 second the man was there, and then when he raised his shotgun and fired, he just disappeared. Johnny's father called the sheriff's office over, but there was no trace of Bruce, and the deputy just said if he comes back, to call them first. Johnny told that story probably 100 times that year, yet just like before, everyone would tease him and deny his story. My mother was pretty close to their family, so she tried to keep a short leash on all three of us boys. But funny enough, she'd always say before we'd go anywhere, "Be careful, and don't let that pedophile go and get you." My brothers would always mockingly say, "We'll kill him before he could even touch us, Mom." I don't know if the story of Bruce ever really bothered my brothers as much as it bothered me. Though even after Johnny's story, I still had a slight bit of skepticism in me. I mean, I never got to see him. Until later. The first time I ever had a Bruce encounter was later that year during a pretty harsh winter. My father was remodeling our sunroom, and due to that, our front door was a plastic tarp stapled to the door frame. And might I add, it was the absolute worst time to not have a door. Snow would get into the front entrance from the storm the night prior, and the entire house would feel like it was -100. But I digress. I remembered it was the weekend, and my birthday was that Friday before. My brothers had scraped up some money to rent me the first Indiana Jones movie, and honestly, it was as much of a gift for me as it was for my brothers. My father was out getting supplies for the sunroom, and my mother was grocery shopping. My brothers and I were sitting on the couch watching the movie intently, and watching that movie you could almost see it in my eyes, the dream to be a cool archaeologist just like Harrison Ford, whip and hat included. Now, I don't know if it was because we were watching so closely, but we never noticed when our father's pickup pulled up. My father came up, flicked my oldest brother's ear, and shouted, "How many times do I have to tell you dipshits to leave your boots outside before coming onto the carpet?" We all stared at each other, confused. My father had his arm outstretched and was pointing at a pair of snow prints that had to have been no closer than 7 feet from the back of the couch. The snow hadn't melted and still looked fresh. "Dad," my brother started saying. We'd been inside for the last, but my dad interrupted him. "Oh, don't give me that bullshit. Go clean that up and go help your mother with the groceries." I still remember the look on my brothers' faces as they stared at each other. Maybe bewilderment, maybe fear. I remember lying in bed that night trying to make up a rational explanation for whose footprints those could have been. Anyone other than Bruce's. Eventually, I was able to fall asleep with some made-up story that sounded logical to someone up late into the night. Later, my brothers both blamed me for the prints, and I became a chore boy for my father because of it. Yet those prints still haunted me, mostly because of how close they were to me. even if there was someone behind us. I mean, surely we would have heard the rustling of the plastic tarp. Obviously, I never told that story to anyone due to the fear of social suicide. I couldn't take those kinds of skeletons following me into high school. Nothing special happened the rest of the winter for my family. My father finally got a door onto the porch just in time for it to finally warm up. In those warm, sweaty nights, I prayed for the house to return to its freezing temperatures. But at that time of the year, for most kids my age, that meant going swimming, partying, and late nights with girlfriends. For me and my brothers, that meant more time to help Dad. Long, grueling hours directly in the sun while working on houses for people whose cars were worth more than my entire family's net worth. After long, drawn-out hours of orders being barked at by our father, our treat was to come home and either buck freshly harvested hay into our barn or tend to the animals. And yet, after all of that, we always had a hearty meal cooked straight from my mother's hands, ready for us at the end of the day. We'd eat till we couldn't pick up a fork, and then just head to bed, wake up, and do it all over again. On the rare occasions that we had days of freedom, my brothers and I would scatter across the town to our respective friend groups, occasionally meeting up at house parties or a bonfire. One of those nights we had off from working with our father, my brothers and I all piled into our older brother's truck and drove off to one of those great bonfire nights. It seemed as if the entire town would show up to those events, and family and friends alike would all show up in droves. The adults with the young ones would come out and eat and enjoy the social aspect. And later in the day, when the sun would try to set, the only ones left would be the teens trying to sneak beer, and the fun uncles supplying them. When we showed up, it was the typical crowd, the ones around my brother's age, with some parents still straggling around. When we stepped out of the truck, the remaining parents said what basically became our tagline anywhere we went. "Oh damn, here comes trouble." The parents and kids our age would laugh as we'd go and sit on the assortment of furniture and bench seats that surrounded the fire. We'd all sit and chat with those who we were familiar with, all while those with more boldness than brains would try to sneak a beer from the coolers, myself included. As the night rolled on and more people showed up, the host's parents would give the same speech every parent would give to all of us kids at these events. "Now, I can't stop you from drinking, but don't be stupid and go off and drive as well. Either sleep it off or call your parents. The phone's inside next to the fridge, and don't you dare wake me up unless one of you's dying." Then they'd smile and wave goodnight as they'd head inside. We'd all say our thanks and commence to having the real party. The older ones would try to go and smoothly talk to one of the few women that showed up, only to get shot down, then walk to the cooler and plop down on one of the random chairs. I remember that night I was sitting down on some broken-down bench seat with one of the springs jabbing into my side. But nonetheless, I would hold my beer and try to be as cool as I possibly could. People were just conversing when my eyes were drawn to something near the tree line at the back of the property. Something artificially white. Through swaying eyes, I was able to focus on a figure standing there. Blue jeans, white shirt, red hat. He had his hands to his side, and it was too far away to make out a face. It took a bit before the thought finally pushed through my drunken mind. "No way," I remember mumbling to myself quietly. My friend who was sitting next to me, who, mind you, was deep into telling me how in love he was with this girl that was across the fire, said annoyingly, "Are you even listening to me right now?" I didn't answer him, but just kept staring back at the man, trying to believe this had to be some trick of the lighting in the shadows. My friend finally turned his head to look at what I was gawking at. "Who is that?" he asked. "I have no idea," I said, "but it kind of looks like that guy everyone was describing last summer." "Dude, that was just a dumb rumor Johnny's parents came up with to," my friend started to say, and I interrupted him, saying, "No, I know. But isn't it kind of weird some adult-looking dude is just standing far out there? I mean, plus, isn't it just miles and miles of forest land back there? Where did he even come from?" I remember looking back at my friend confused. He stared back at me, and you could almost see a glimmer of fear pass across his eyes. Our eyes narrowed, and instantly we both darted our heads back to the tree line. And there was nothing, just the outline of trees and darkness. Suddenly, that fire didn't feel so warm, and the cool summer air just felt plain cold. Our eyes searched across the trees, trying to get a glimpse of what we had just seen, but there honestly wasn't anything but trees and trees. We turned back to each other, and that fear became something closer to confusion. We both knew it had only been a second or so that our eyes were off of him, yet there was no trace of him. We looked around the fire to see if anyone else had seen what we just had, yet everyone seemed too deep into their conversations to notice or care. Then, to almost cut the tension that lingered in the air, my oldest brother grasped both of my shoulders. Instantly, I leapt up and stiffened. My brother mockingly said something along the lines of, "What, still scared of the dark, you pussy?" I laughed it off and said something vulgar back to him, and he told me that our older brother was still trying to get lucky, so he'd be spending the night there. My oldest brother was going to go home, and he asked if I wanted to go home as well. He wasn't much of a drinker, so I knew at the very least it'd be a good chance to get home safe instead of sleeping in some field. So the two of us got into his pickup, and we waved goodbye to the remaining few. We drove off back down the road, all while music played from the late-night radio. By the time we got home, that lingering eeriness I had felt all but left, and I thanked my brother for the ride and went to lay down on the couch, not having the energy to crawl upstairs and into my bed. As the night's events faded into my memory, the obvious thing remained painted on the inside of my eyelids. That man standing out in the tree line, watching us like he was one of the trees. And that same chill I felt crawled its way up my spine as my mind slipped into unconsciousness. After that, I remember a small burning feeling deep in my stomach any time I would think about Bruce. The only way I can even think to describe it was the feeling of a cornered, frightened animal. That time in my life was pretty tumultuous. I wasn't always in constant fear, but it was as if saying his name would summon him. Then slowly, the thought of him would creep into my mind, and that deep, burning feeling would follow. Over that summer as well, I remember my mother being extra worried about my brothers and me. She had a knack for keeping us away from danger, and it almost seemed as if she could read the future. Mom always kept tabs on us wherever we went, and if she didn't like what we were up to, she'd veto it. My brothers and I would complain and get upset, but she always held her ground, and my father would soon follow suit, and then we'd lose our nerve. Yet my mother was always right for not sending us off. There was one time my brother and I were going to go four-wheeling in the forest, but she said no. Now, we'd been out on that trail with our four-wheelers for as long as we could drive them, so when she said no, we were both irritated. But my mother put her foot down, and we eventually lost interest in fighting with her and went to do something else. And she was right. The rainfall that day became severe, and the river that ran along the trail became a flash flood. And even if we had been able to escape that flood, I don't know if we would have been able to find our way home. While 90% of the time when my mother would say no, there wouldn't be any danger or something minor would happen. And that said, I was always grateful for that 10% of the time. One of those times where my mother said no was toward the end of summer. Everyone that was anyone was going to be at this log cabin for a party, and it was my buddy Kyle's parents' place. They allowed him to throw a party up there once a summer. When I went to ask my dad and mom for permission, it seemed like the easiest yes I could get. I'd been to that cabin before, and I had no work to do with my father, and both of my parents loved Kyle's family. My father's face looked as if he was going to say, "Sure, I don't care, just be safe." But my mother's face looked less promising. Her eyes narrowed and she was chewing her cheek in thought. My mother always would make this face when she was thinking. It could be as simple as deciding what brand of soup to buy, or as serious as telling someone a truth that might break their heart. My father turned his head to see my mother deep in thought, and his facial expression changed from his neutral, stoic tone to more of a stern, defensive look. He could tell what my mother was going to say even before she knew it, one of the perks of them being married for so long. When my mother finally decided to speak, I already knew the answer. It didn't mean it didn't sting a little, nor that I wouldn't try to fight it. But in the end, the ruling stood, and I was told decisively, "Nope, you can't go." Next thing I knew, I was lying in my room and looking at the evening sun heading west, and as upset as I was, I knew I had no chance to convince either of my parents. Once my mother said those words, they might as well have become one of the commandments. Not being a teenage boy with less brains than a goldfish, I decided to do something even my rebellious brothers wouldn't dare to do. I went against my mother's no. Those parties at Kyle's cabins were everything back then. The year prior, his older brother hosted and became something of a legend. Everyone from the valley who knew each other would meet up at the base of the lake, and we'd all drive up to the cabin in a convoy. Last year was my first time up at the cabin, and it was 3 days of absolutely anything we wanted to do. Fishing, swimming, partying, card games, cooking. Seriously, we did it all. And most importantly, if I wanted a chance to spend time with a lady, this was the last opportunity I'd have before school started again. In my prepubescent mind, drinking, fishing, and chicks sounded like a good reason to break any rule. So I called Kyle's house and told them to meet me down the road from my house in about 2 hours. And he said okay and asked why I wouldn't meet him at my house, and I just told him, "I'll tell you later. Just meet me around 2 houses down." We hung up the phone, and I knew I had no chance of turning back. The 2 hours came and went while I behaved and did my chores. My parents were early sleepers, so when the clock struck 7 p.m., they both retired to their room. Sure enough, 7 p.m. rolled around, and I was getting hugs and kisses goodnight from my mother. She kissed my forehead and said, "I'm sorry you can't go to your friend's house, honey. I just want you to be safe, and I have an icky feeling about you going." "It's totally okay, Mom," I said. "I'll just rewatch that movie. Tim hasn't bothered to return it yet." Tim was my middle brother. When my mother finally left the room with my father, I started to play one of the stacks of movies Tim had piled against the TV. I told Kyle I'd meet him at 8, so I'd have some cushion time for my parents to fall asleep. When it was time for me to leave, I left the TV on as I crept out the front door. I snuck past my parents' window and then barreled down to Mrs. Jacobs' mailbox. Sure enough, the familiar sound of Kyle's clapped-out Chevy came rumbling. And when he finally stopped, I basically hurled myself into his truck and we sped off. Driving down the back roads, Kyle obviously asked me why he didn't just meet me at my house, and I told him exactly why. "Dude," he said, "you're going against your mom right now? Are you serious?" Everyone in town knew that when my mother said no, none of us boys were getting out of it. My oldest brother, Arthur, once had to sell his Iron Maiden tickets in '83. I mean, he'd saved up for weeks when he first heard they'd be playing in Seattle. "Yeah," I said, "but I doubt they'll even notice me gone. Dad's got work all day tomorrow, and Mom's most likely going shopping, then off to book club. It's a risk, but as long as I get home before my father, I'm doubtful they'll notice me gone." It was a serious risk, but also a thought-out one. As long as I was home in time for dinner, my mother and father shouldn't have any questions. "So, how are you going to get home? I'm staying the full 3 days, Kyle said. "Tim owes me big time," I responded, "and I'll just walk to the ranger station and call him and tell him to come get me tomorrow morning." "And what exactly does he owe you for?" Kyle said, puzzled. "He's been renting movies and hasn't returned any of them. I've been the one intercepting the late fees from the mail." Kyle just smiled and nodded in approval. We spoke about just anything we could to pass the time as we made our way up the mountain. Everyone had already left the base of the lake, so we just decided to make it a straight shot to the cabin. Pulling up, I could already tell what kind of night was in store for me. There was a certain unnatural blending of the scene before me, and the forest was hushed with a rhythmic breathing of cool air that swayed the trees. Then the cabin in front of me, man-made, was playing what sounded like muffled rock music and loud chatter. I remember this very distinctly, just because of how surreal it was. As we walked inside, friends would turn their heads at us and smile. Some came over for hugs, while others came and chatted us up. After rounds and rounds of conversations and loud music for hours and several rejections from multiple different chicks, the night felt like it was beginning to close. People were already getting tense, ready to sleep outside and watch the stars, while others already lay on the ground of the cabin in a drunken stupor. As for me, I got special treatment due to being close with Kyle. I got to sleep on one of the 3 beds they had in the cabin. I remember lying there in bed with the sheets off to one side. The cool summer breeze from the open window was the perfect amount of air to cool myself off. As I dozed off, thinking about my plan of action for tomorrow in case anything went awry, I remembered that chill feeling slither down my spine again. This time I thought I was just getting cold, so I covered my top half with the blankets, leaving my feet exposed so I could still feel the cool air. In my defense, we were a couple of hours away from our town, and the only peeping Toms at the cabin that night would likely be wildlife. I was getting to the part of the night where my mind was in the middle of sleep and being awake, like the powering down stage before fully sleeping. My mind was free from the thought when I felt something light move along my leg. And I've dealt with small bugs and flies making their way onto me, so I shook my leg and got it off without fully waking myself up. A couple of minutes went by, and another bug got onto my leg. At that point, I was too tired to care, so I just let it do its thing, and I felt it move from the top of my foot to my ankle. Though this time, the bug seemed uncharacteristically heavy, like its weight would fluctuate as it dragged its body. I was puzzled at what kind of bug this could even be. My mind couldn't figure out what it was, even remotely, so just as curiosity killed the cat, I opened my eyes. There was no bug. Just a slender man with half of his body looming through the open window, with his arm outstretched in front of him, his index finger dragging across the top of my foot. The lighting in the woods obscured his face, yet I could tell by his red hat that he was looking directly at me. Before my brain finally made the connection, the man's arm slowly retracted back to his side, all while he slithered outside of the window in a swift, slow motion. He made no reaction or sound when he noticed me awake, just a methodical motion of retreat. Before I knew it, my heart was cranked to 11. My boots were on, and I was halfway out the door before my mind finally woke up. When I stepped outside, the only thing I spotted was that artificial white color, approximately 100 feet from the entrance of the cabin. And I felt that burning feeling again, and my heart felt like it was going to tear open from stress. As the white figure slowly disappeared back into the tree line, the only thing I was left with was my breathing and the cool air breezing past me. In all my years on this earth, that was the most alone I have ever felt. No horror movie, book, or any piece of media could ever compare to that fear. The only sense of comfort, if you could call it comfort, was knowing that I wasn't the only victim this man had. The next few events are somewhat hazy. I remember I grabbed the rest of my clothes and got dressed again, and I started to head to the park ranger's office that wasn't too far from the main road. By the time I got off the access road and onto the main road, I was accompanied by the early morning sky. Even with the sun out, I still felt an unnatural sense of dread. I could almost feel it sloshing around in my stomach as I walked down the road. When I walked into the ranger station, I asked the half-asleep man to borrow his phone. "Hey, sir, I apologize for bothering you, but I got lost on a trail I was supposed to hike this morning. Can I bother you to use my phone to call my brother? I just want to go home." The man looked at me over his coffee mug with his eyebrows raised, and he moved the phone on his desk closer to me and stood up. "Go ahead. I have to go to the campsites near the water and make sure everything's square down there, but please, no long-distance calls. And if you need me, there's a radio behind you. I'll be back in an hour." And then he left, making his way to the door. I was more shocked that the lie actually worked. When I dialed the house phone, and thankfully my oldest brother Arthur answered. I told him to go and get Tim and put him on the phone. When Tim finally got up and answered, we went back and forth for a bit, mostly him saying there was no way in hell he was coming up there to get me, with me retorting that I would give Dad all the late notices for his rented movies. Eventually, he caved and we ended up on agreement. I'd give him the late notices and he'd keep his mouth shut if I did his chores for the week. It sounded fair to me at the time, anything to get me out of the forest. Eventually, both of my brothers finally showed up, and I grabbed my stuff, hopped into the middle seat, and we drove off from the ranger station. "You're fucked, by the way," Arthur said. I turned to face him, confused. "Yeah, Mom went in to grab you this morning so she could get you new clothes for the school year. And guess who was nowhere to be found," Tim added. "Oh, shit," I said, defeated. That drive back into town was filled with emotion. On one hand, I didn't want to see the wrath of my father and mother after disobeying them. On the other hand, I was just thankful to be far away from the cabin. I remembered looking out the window into the rows and rows of trees, thinking about how large the forest was. Yet the presence of that guy was felt throughout it, almost as if he could just be behind any one of those trees. When we finally got home, I knew exactly how fucked I really was. I saw my dad's truck parked in the driveway in the middle of the day. When I walked into the house, both of my brothers raced around me and my parents and went straight into their rooms, almost as if the next coming seconds were going to have nuclear fallout. The next couple of hours of that day were my parents telling me how reckless and stupid my actions were, followed by the ways I was going to be punished. I don't remember exactly what the punishment was, mostly because it became a snowball of several smaller punishments that culminated over the next several months. Through everything that I went through that night, I eventually learned that I wasn't the only one who had an encounter with Bruce up at that cabin. But that story is for another time. Uncle Josh note here. When I found this, I saw a comment that this was too well written to be anything other than a creepypasta, but the author has assured everyone that he did write it and took time to write it well, but everything that he wrote here was 100% true and none of this was made up, and I tend to believe him. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this episode on YouTube and you like what you heard, please give the video a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, why not become one? Hit the notification bell for every time that I upload, and of course, leave me your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. Follow me on social media. There's links to that in the description. And if you'd like to take your support of what I'm doing a step further, there's also a link to my Patreon page and a link to my storefront at tpublic.com. Get yourself some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.